Written records going back, well, to the 1490s and earlier, really, that help tell the history of this island, its people, its culture, its politics.
The digital does enable people from around the world to experience that archive in some way and to learn about the history of the island.
When we take records in that do have closure periods and things on them, it can feel, oh, these records aren't going to be available for another 50 years to the public. But actually, it's part of preserving that legacy for the future.
Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Exploring Island Heritage. Today we're finding out more about the process of storing and preserving some of the documents and publications held in the Manx Museum Library and Archives and the Public Record Office. Wendy Thirkettle is the archivist in the Manx Museum Library and Archives.
I'd say it's partly the written heritage of the Isle of Man, because we hold an immense assortment of both printed books on the library side, but the archive side is papers, records, written records going back, well, to the 1490s and earlier, really, that help tell the history of this island, its people, its culture, its politics. There's also an awful lot which is image-wise, so we have photographs, we have earlier prints before photography, we have posters, so it's not all the written word. There's a lot more besides, and the other thing, I suppose, is that there's an awful lot to do with mapping the island. So maps, plans that show how the land use has changed. The resources keep on going and they keep changing, so we have film and sound archives, and of course we're now in the digital era, and so material is coming in different and new formats.
How do you acquire the material? Where does it come from, essentially?
A lot from private hands. We are the Diocesan Record Office, so we get resources from Manx parishes and the diocese and other churches besides. But a lot of it is from private hands, and that might include business archives when businesses cease trading. It might be when a society or association has finished and people want to deposit their minute books and other resources for safekeeping. It varies day to day. I'm never quite sure what I'm going to be offered.
How do you decide what to take, what to keep and what not to?
You do have to be selective. It goes probably without saying, but we have to assess material on its research potential, on the evidence it contains, how useful that might be and how important that is to keep for accountability. And because we're a museum service, also maybe it might be quite ephemeral but have great exhibition value. So we have content currently in that's entertainment exhibition, and that includes playbills and programmes and bits and pieces that tell the entertainment history of the Isle of Man.
And there are some things there that you wouldn't necessarily think would have survived because they were very much, they were kind of disposable in their day.
Yeah, very much, and sometimes the paper wasn't particularly good quality and it comes damaged, but that potentially adds to its charm and its character. Yes, possibly more by luck than design that the content does survive. A lot of material gets destroyed intentionally or by accident, and we can only keep a selection, so we're not trying to be all-inclusive. But sometimes resources come to us that have got a wow factor. Sometimes they might be really everyday, so people might not think we'd be interested in, for example, diaries telling the everyday routine of people, but they have their own interest as well.
And who uses the library and archives? I mean, who is it accessible to?
It's accessible to everyone. We ask people to just do a simple registration form, but there's no age limit, so young to old. And we have people coming in. It could be school projects, it might be university students doing a dissertation, it could be people from advocates firms doing some conveyancing, using our registered deeds. We've got a wide variety of people, and we have access to the internet through our laptop suite, so people might access the iMuseum or other family history websites using our search room.
And giving the public access to certain things must come with conditions, I suppose, because there must be some things in the archives that are fragile.
There are. It depends on how robust an item is, whether we can produce it in the search room. We will do our best, but sometimes material is just too fragile. It is literally falling to pieces. And we can protect it sometimes using protective sleeves and kind of make sort of interim means to try to improve access. But sometimes things do need conservation before they can be produced. Generally, the older the paper, the better quality. So people might be surprised, but some of the early 18th century papers, for instance, are beautiful. They're handmade, and they do very well compared to modern paper.
What are the most significant items within the archive?
In some ways, we're spoilt for choice. I mean, we have the papers of the Dukes of Atholl, who were one time owners of the island, and the Earls of Derby. So they're really special resources. It's very tricky because we've got so much and it's so varied. So we've got, for example, a lot of strength in the 18th century I mentioned. We've got merchants' papers, businessmen's papers, correspondence. It's really eclectic, the mix sometimes. For instance, we've got papers to do with individuals who are Manx born but perhaps had their working career off islands. So an example is Sir Ralph Stevenson, who was a diplomat and who served in Egypt and Japan, had a really interesting career off island, came back to be an MHK. So he's just one example of some fascinating people whose lives are told by the resources that they've left behind.
Now, you must be getting things all the time, really, brought in, or new books that are published that you want to add to your collection. What do you do with them when you get something? What happens? What's the process once you decide you want to keep something?
Well, we have a librarian, Susie, and she will process the printed matter, be it books and pamphlets, with our assistants, Kim and Sarah. With the archives and with printed, we allot a unique reference number to each item. So what we're trying to do is to record the provenance, so where things have come from. That's important for the integrity, especially with archives, because you're wanting to show that this resource is trustworthy. So there's a lot of processing that goes on, and then the core description, the idea is to put more and more information available to search on iMuseum. So the public can actually check out the material we've got, and then if it's available for research, they fill out request slips in the reading room. They can come in and they can actually look at the item.
Archivist in the Manx Museum Library and Archives, Wendy Thirkettle. The reading room is open on Wednesdays to Saturdays between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. And if there is a particular piece of information you want to find out, it might be useful to contact the Library and Archives team in advance of your visit. You can do that by telephoning 648 047 or emailing library@mnh.gov.im. As we've heard, there are a number of items in the Manx National Heritage Archives and collections available to view online via the iMuseum. So just what is available to access in a digital format, and how often is that information updated? Jude Dicken is Collections Information Manager for Manx National Heritage.
I mean, we're constantly adding to it. We have a really incredible system which every night, would you believe, at 7 p.m. on the dot, refreshes what's online. So anything that we've made changes to on our system during the day about our collections, any more information we've added, and if that item is okay to be published to iMuseum, then that information is automatically updated and you'll see that. But we also, aside from that day-to-day business, we also have digitisation projects which we schedule every year. And really exciting one in the offing at the moment is around the Manx crosses, which are there's around 205 of those dotted around the island in churches, in the landscape, and some indeed at the museum. And they basically scan it with almost like an arm, a pen on an arm. That's the best way I can describe it. And they create a 3D exact model of the Manx cross, but in huge amounts of detail. So we're really understanding those crosses to a level that we've never understood them before. Well, those scans are near completion now, and by December this year, we will have those scans as low-resolution images available for everyone to see for free on iMuseum, and also on a platform called Sketchfab, which I'm told is the YouTube for 3D images, which opens our Manx crosses out to a huge audience around the world. So they'll be going online in December. We're also, next year, digitising more of our Manx Press picture archive. Some of your listeners may remember the This Is Summer exhibition at the House of Manannan, I think a couple of years ago. Hugely popular. Images of Ken Dodd, Sir Ken Dodd, and the Rolling Stones at Ferrybridge, to name just a couple, from the 1960s and 70s, and we had such fantastic feedback from that, people remembering the island at that time, that we've decided to digitise 1,000 more. And this time, you won't be surprised to hear that we're calling it This is Winter, and we're going to show really what happened on the island in the 60s and 70s during those dark months of October to February. And surprisingly, a heck of a lot happened. So we're going to be digitising those in April, May, and they'll be available again next year. We're also currently at the moment sharing our watercolours, a lot of our watercolour collection, which again is already on iMuseum, but we're sharing them with the Watercolour World, which is a new portal, but we're sharing that content as well with them, all about reaching as wide an audience as possible, because we really want to celebrate the collections we have here on the Isle of Man and make them known to people.
And one of the first things that went on iMuseum was the newspapers. I mean, are they proving popular?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we love the newspapers. So if you don't know about the newspapers, again, check it out, imuseum.im. Just click on the newspapers and publications link, and it will take you to a site where you can word search by word all the Manx newspapers from 1792, which is the earliest newspaper we have in our collection, the Manx Mercury, all the way through to 1960. That's around 400,000 pages of newsprint. We have subscribers still using that site around the world, and we hear the stories about what they've been finding as well, which is wonderful. You can also access iMuseum newspapers and publications through our reading room again at the Library and Archives, open Wednesday to Saturday, and there you can use it for free. And you can also receive some top tips from our Library and Archives team on how to search. So if you're not too certain about how to, get started, then do go into the Library and Archives, and our team are there to help you discover what you want to discover.
Collections Information Manager for Manx National Heritage, Jude Dicken. And we'll return to the notion of accessing information from the archives online later in the programme. You're listening to Exploring Island Heritage, and on this week's programme we're finding out about the process of collecting and storing documents and publications relating to aspects of the island's history and heritage. Another body which collects documents of historical importance is the Public Record Office. Eleanor Williams is a Records and Archives Officer, and Angela Skitt is Public Records Officer.
The Public Record Office is the historic archive for all of the Isle of Man public bodies. So we work very actively with all the public bodies on the island. They create a very large volume of records, so we have to work with them to pick those that are of historic and cultural significance for the long term, and then we transfer them to the Record Office at the appropriate time, with the view that they'll be made available to the public for research as an archives resource.
That must be an interesting task, deciding what to keep, what not to keep.
It is, yes. It's really, really interesting job. Yeah, very varied. We get to see lots of different types of records. We have kind of selection principles that we are looking for when we're going out to assess records. We're really interested in things that are demonstrating the core decisions and policy and functions and activities of the public bodies. We're also interested in things that have a kind of long-term informational value in terms of demonstrating the impact of the public body's work on the island citizens, things like the impact on the landscape. So we collect a lot of maps and plans and things like that that demonstrate infrastructure projects and planning and those kind of things that are having a big impact on the landscape. So yeah, it's very, very varied.
And when you say public bodies, what does that entail? Which public bodies is that? Because you think government, yes. But, central government and the government departments, but it's much broader remit than that.
It is, yes. So we take records from Tynwald, we take records from all 22 local authorities, the courts, school records as well. So yeah, it's really, really varied, and obviously the central government departments as well.
So where do you keep them and how are they stored?
Should we go through to the stores and we'll show you?
This is one of our stores. This is what we call Unit 40, and this is on the Spring Valley Estate in Braddon. but we also have another store on the estate as well, which we call Unit 3.
Within the two stores, there are over 5 kilometres of records stored. So if you lined them up in a line, they'd go from the sea terminal all the way up the prom to the terminus and back down again. Yeah. So there's a lot of records here. The climate within the stores is really important to kind of looking after the records. You can feel it's a bit chilly. They are temperature and humidity controlled, so we try to keep the temperature between 13 and 18 degrees centigrade, and then the relative humidity between 45 and 55%. So if it gets too cold, too dry, the records go brittle. If it's too hot or moist, then you get things like mould growth. So it's really, really important that the stores are all kept environmentally controlled. We also have a project in place to repackage the collections as well. So packaging is really important to the preservation of the records, because we're trying to preserve them forever for our heritage. We use special packaging, which is acid-free, neutral, to avoid those chemical interactions between the documents stored in them and the actual packaging.
And in terms of the format, you've got shelves and shelves with lots of boxes in them. Presumably these are all paper records, essentially.
Yes, they are. Majority are paper. We have some digital records, whether they're on kind of USB sticks or floppy disks. I think people remember them. But yeah, majority are paper. We do realise digital records are becoming the norm, and lots of records are now born digital, so we have actually got a project in place where we are going to be tackling that idea of how do we store digital records, and we have a plan for the next few years, so watch this space.
Interesting that if you've got things like floppy disks and USB, maybe not so complicated right at this moment in time, but with changing technology, I'm assuming that means you have to keep the technology to access the records which are in a certain format.
Yes, there's a number of different challenges with digital preservation. That rapidly changing technology is one of the big challenges, in that, as fast as you create something, the software providers have updated the version, created a new piece of software, and actually things are going out of date all the time. So there's the element of making sure that you're migrating records through different formats to keep storing them. But there's also that idea that if you're creating a record in a particular database, or say you're using computer-aided design for maps and plans, actually the way in which that was displayed on the screen is really important to understanding the records. So there's actually that process to look at of, can we emulate those software packages in the future, so that we can show the researcher in 100 years' time how that record would have been displayed on a computer screen now. So it's big challenges for us, but it's a really exciting time for archives in tackling those challenges. Shall we take you through to the reading room now? So our reading room area is at Unit 40 on Spring Valley. This is our reading room. This is where members of the public can come and visit. So we're open Thursdays and Fridays, and we're open for people to come and research using the records that we have. We get a wide variety of users coming, because we're open to everyone. People doing family history, researching local history. They might be researching the history of their property. Yes. So we have a lot of planning applications that help with that. We get academic researchers.
We get a lot of education inquiries as well. Lots of people trying to find records from when they're at school as well.
Really lots of different types of inquiries. I suppose the other thing to say, as well as people visiting here, is we do try to make the records accessible in other ways too. Not everybody wants to come into a reading room and actually do study and look at records as a researcher, but people are generally interested in the history of the island and what we have. So we do public tours, we take part in the Heritage Open Days annually as well, to try and give people the opportunity to come enjoy the archives without having to come and study in this room. So
they like to talk as well about their experiences on the island and the history of the island, and I think especially with the type of records that we work with, for example, with maps and plans, that's such a conversation starter. If you go out and you are showing a particular map and people can recognise, landmarks, and it just kind of, you get a lot of stories as well. So it's great to hear other people's, points of of their history as well. You know, even though we are the corporate National Archive of public bodies, it's great to get that social aspect as well when we go out and speak to people.
This is one of the items, actually, talking about maps and plans, that we often show. Again, it gets that conversation going. When we have group visits in, people love to pore over it and talk about the plan. This is a plan of Douglas, but it's only the areas that were in Braddon Parish. It's dated 1842. And it was produced as part of the Tithe Commutation Act of 1839. That act said that all property on the island had to be valued to determine what the tithe contribution was going to be, what the financial value of that was. And so this plan shows every single property that was in the Braddon area.
Right, so it goes that far back, 1842.
Our records, though, date from the 18th century. One of our earliest is
This one
1704, which is one of the Acts of Tynwald. So one of our roles is to keep all the Acts of Tynwald, and we receive them every year after the Tynwald ceremony and to preserve them. This is the Act of Settlement of 1704, really, really important document for the island, and it's often called the Manx Magna Carta. It's on 2 sheets of vellum, which is calf skin, and the story behind the Act is that at the time, the Lords of Man controlled the land, and the Manx farmers, they weren't allowed to sell their land, to leave it to someone in their will, because they held it from the Lords of Man. And so they would be fined if they tried to do any of those things. This act resolved that and actually gave the farmers back rights over their land. It was negotiated by Bishop Thomas Wilson with the 10th Earl Stanley at the time, James Stanley. And it's really interesting in that on the second sheet of vellum, it includes all the names of the dignitaries who were at the Tynwald ceremony. So these are their signatures when they actually passed the Act, which is in June 1704. And then a month later, it tells you the Act was actually proclaimed on Tynwald Hill at the Tynwald ceremony, and then you've got all the signatures again of all the dignitaries that were there.
It is quite amazing that that still exists and it is in such good condition.
Yes, it is in good condition. At the moment, it's stored folded because that was the way that it came to us, and that's the way the folds kind of naturally fall. We would like to have it some more conservation treatment on it, to have it actually flattened so we can store it flat for preservation purposes. So that's something that we're looking at the moment. But yes, it's amazing that over 300 years later, it's still.
And vellum is a very stable form of document as well. They still print the acts today on vellum.
Still?
Yes, still.
Really?
Yes.
The ones they have at Tynwald, they are on vellum?
They are, yeah.
So are the documents that come here the ones that are signed by the President of Tynwald during the captioning ceremony?
Yes, they are. Yes.
And on
So
MNH
they're the
codes as well.
originals, yeah. So they're on vellum. It does look very different to the vellum 300 years ago, and then they look almost like sheets of paper, just thick paper, the way that the vellum is made now. But yes, it's vellum.
Yeah, cataloguing must be an interesting process. Are you sort of going backwards still to catalogue things, or are you up to date and just doing the contemporary stuff?
No, we do have records waiting to be catalogued. What tends to happen is, as we transfer a set of records, it really depends on how big a collection it is. We try to prioritise as well those collections that are going to be open to the public straight away. A lot of our records, because our records, some of them are quite modern and some of the 20th century, they may have things like personal data in them that can't be released to the public straight away. And sometimes there will be what's called a closure period on the records, which means that they aren't made available to the public straight away because they've got that sensitive personal data within them, and where we'd have a legal obligation to keep that confidential for a certain length of time. So we try and prioritise those collections that are going to be available straight away for cataloguing, knowing that those that aren't going to be used by the public for a certain length of time, can be lower down the priority order. We are really here building that legacy for the future as well. I think sometimes when we take records in that do have closure periods and things on them, it can feel, these records aren't going to be available for another 50 years to the public. But actually it's part of preserving that legacy for the future.
Public Records Officer Angela Skitt and Records and Archives Officer Eleanor Williams. And the Public Record Office is open to the public if you have an inquiry about a particular document. Full details of how to do that can be found on the Public Record Office website. And it's another body which is taking part in this year's Heritage Open Days. But again, all of the places on that tour are already booked. But there are still a number of other opportunities to find out about aspects of the island's heritage this weekend. many of which you don't need to book a place for. Full details of all of those events can be found on the Manx National Heritage website. Finally, on this week's programme, we return to the notion of accessing the Manx National Heritage Archives digitally. So how has the appetite for accessing the information online compared to seeing the physical documents changed in recent years? Jude Dicken again.
That's an interesting one. In fact, yesterday I had 2 students in here on placement with us, and we were looking at newspapers and publications. And one of them actually said to me, "Oh, does that mean you've thrown all the newspapers away?" And I said, "No, it doesn't. We've digitised them, but obviously we still keep and store the original newspapers." And, that made me think, actually, about this move towards digital. I was at a conference at the British Museum a couple of weeks ago where me and my colleague were talking and there was all talk there about digital objects and how the digital is replacing the museum object and the debate around that. Certainly, in terms of usership, certainly people are accessing collections more online, but that is not in any way diminishing the need and the requirement for museums and galleries to maintain the original object. There's something about an object, and when I say object I also mean an archive. There's something about that original document that will never ever be surpassed by a digital image of it. But the digital does enable people from around the world to experience that item, that object, that archive in some way, and to learn about the history of the island. So I wouldn't want to put them in competition with one another. They're doing different things, but both are equally important.
Collections Information Manager for Manx National Heritage, Jude Dicken. That's it for this week's programme. We'll be exploring more island heritage at the same time next week.